All right, starting off at number 10, we've got to look at the story of Adam and Eve. God created the Garden of Eden for Adam and Eve. In the middle of the garden, there was a single tree with fruit that was forbidden to them. Now, thanks to the crafty serpent, aka Satan, Eve and Adam were tricked into ignoring God's command. One of the consequences they faced was that they became instantly aware of their own nakedness. Imagine how uncomfortable you would feel if, after having lived in oblivious nudity without any feelings of shame, you took a bite of a contraband fruit and suddenly realized, like, oh crap, I'm naked and completely vulnerable to this other person. Meanwhile, with a growing feeling of shame about your own body, which was now exposed. Up next, we have the story of the talking donkey. King Balak of the Moabites worried about Israel's military advantage and requested Balaam's service, which basically consisted mainly of blessing and or cursing people depending on God's instructions. Balaam saddled up his donkey and hit the road toward the Moabite king. However, God became angry with Balaam for going and sent an angel with a sword to block his path. Upon seeing the angel, the donkey stopped immediately, but for some reason, Balaam couldn't see the angel and began beating the frightened donkey to keep it moving. That was until finally the donkey miraculously spoke words and told Balaam off. Balaam became even more embarrassed and repentant when the angel informed him that if it were not for the donkey, who stopped upon seeing him, Balaam would not be alive at this moment. All right, this next one is just cringe, 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 even from the title, 100 foreskins. Before David became Israel's king, he had to put up with a rather jealous King Saul who hated him, especially after discovering that his daughter Michal was in love with David. Saul declared that if he wanted to marry Michal, David would need to bring him the foreskins of 100 Philistine enemy soldiers. King Saul did not expect David to survive, so when David returned with 200 foreskins, Saul was shocked and had to hand over his daughter. Now for me, how cringy is it though that the value of his daughter's hand in marriage was set at 100 foreskins? Just like, ew. And up next, we have the story of naked Noah. One night, after having too much to drink, Noah passed out drunk and completely naked in his tent. While unconscious, his son Ham walked in on him naked. So instead of honoring his father by covering him up, he went and joked about it to his brothers Shem and Japheth. They immediately walked backwards into Noah's tent to cover him up without observing his nakedness. Now, it must have been pretty embarrassing as a father to wake up and hear stories about your son having walked in on you completely naked, and then instead of respectfully covering you, joking about it to everyone else. Up at number 6, we have a story about forced honoring. As a high-ranking official, Haman was offended when a Jew named Mordecai refused to bow to him. To get revenge, Haman tried to convince the king to let him issue a decree that would legalize the termination of all Jews throughout the kingdom. I feel like that's quite a severe overreaction. What Haman didn't realize was that the Queen Esther happened to be a Jew, as well as Mordecai's cousin. In addition, Mordecai was directly responsible for exposing a plot to assassinate the king, so the king wanted to honor him. The king went to Haman for advice about how to honor a man who had pleased the king. Haman, stupidly assuming that he was the one to be honored, came up with a wonderful plan. The king loved the plan so much that he ordered Haman to carry it out, but in honor of Mordecai. Thus, an embarrassed Haman was forced to lead Mordecai, the man he despised, dressed in royal robes and mounted on a royal horse, through the city streets, announcing to everyone that the king approved of Mordecai. And at the halfway point in today's video, we have the story of Jesus' betrayer. Judas is famous for accepting payment to lead Jesus into enemy hands. Shockingly, his plot was brought to light by Jesus himself. After announcing to his disciples that a traitor was in their midst, Jesus exposed Judas' secret plans by stating that the one he hands a piece of bread to would betray him. Imagine how awkward Judas must have felt accepting the piece of bread from Jesus. Surprised by the whole situation, reason, Judas left to, of course, fulfill the plan as Jesus said he would. Even more cringy, though, was the fact that Judas had the nerve to greet Jesus with a kiss in the Garden of Gethsemane just as he was betraying him. And moving on to God and Abram. When the Lord appeared to the 99-year-old Abram, he laid out the rules for confirming the covenant between them. In exchange for being the father of many nations, inheriting the land of Canaan, and becoming fruitful, Abram needed to do a couple of things. Number one, he had to walk blamelessly before the Lord. Number two, he had to change his name to Abraham instead of Abram. And number three, this is the kicker, he had to cut off his foreskin. Now, I'm sure that Abram probably wasn't shocked by the idea of changing his name or living an honest life, but undergoing a circumcision, that must have seemed like a pretty random request, not to mention how awkward it must have been for him to do at the age of 99. And up at number three, we have the story of the unfaithful woman. The prophet Hosea must have been shocked when God instructed him to marry a prostitute. And oh, by the way, she's gonna cheat on you too. Can you imagine how cringy it must have been to stand there and have to marry a street worker who you already knew was going to cheat on you? But he did it. And just as God said, after bearing 3 children to Hosea, his wife took another lover. In order to show how devoted he was to the people of Israel, God ordered Hosea to show unconditional love to his wife by buying her back from the man she'd been sleeping with. In a way, this is a story of forgiveness, but at the same time, it would also be pretty awkward paying someone to give you back your own wife. Our next story is that of deceiving Jacob. Laban had 2 daughters named Leah and Rachel. Rachel's beauty captivated his nephew Jacob. Now, in order to win Rachel as his wife, Jacob promised to become Laban's employee, or basically a slave, for 7 years. But when the wedding day finally arrived, the devious Laban, in an attempt to marry off his oldest daughter first, dressed up Leah as Jacob's bride instead of Rachel. So you must be wondering, how did he not notice? Well, the veiled wedding outfit combined with the darkness of the marriage chamber prevented Jacob from noticing a problem until the next morning. Now, how cringy would it be to wake up thinking you're lying next to the love of your life, who you slaved away for 7 years, only to find out that you had been tricked? Even more insane is that Jacob worked another 7 years for Laban just to finally be able to marry Rachel as well. Now, man, that is commitment and love. All right, and all the way down to number 1, we have the story of Lot's daughters. This is probably the most cringy to me. All right, so after fleeing from the smoldering wasteland that had been Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his daughters settled in a deserted mountainous region. His 2 daughters, believing that most of the world had been destroyed by fire and brimstone, concluded that in order for them to preserve their family line, they would have to get their father drunk and then, well, spend the night with him. I know. So for 2 consecutive nights, 1 night for each daughter, they managed to get their father so completely smashed that he apparently wasn't aware of what was happening. Now, what I'm wondering, would this situation have been more awkward for the daughters or for Lot, especially when he realized what had happened and that both daughters were pregnant with his children? I mean, it's like, hey children, meet your father, also your grandfather. Major cringe factor here, my friends.
Starting at number 10, we have the fish and the coins. You can find the story in the book of Matthew chapter 17 verses 24 to 26. Jesus and his disciples, they're asked to pay their taxes, and Jesus says that they are exempt, but out of politeness, he actually agrees to go and pay for the taxes, but in a very supernatural way. What he did was he made 4 drachma coins appear inside of a fish, and when it was caught, he and his apostle Peter were able to pay their taxes. Now, moving on to the story at number 9, God wrestles a man. This account is taken from the book of Genesis 32 verses 22 to 31. Now, the prophet Jacob is moving to a different place, and his wife as well as his 11 sons have gone ahead of him. But out of nowhere, without any warning, he starts wrestling with a man who just shows up. And this goes all night. Now, when the man is at a disadvantage, he knows that he's losing. What happens is he touches Jacob's hip and it pops out of place. Now, Jacob says that he's not going to let go of this man until he gets a blessing from him. So the man ends up admitting that he is actually God, and he pops Jacob's hip back in place. Number 8 brings us the mysterious resurrections in the book of Matthew, chapter 27, verse 52. The Gospel of Matthew claims that Jesus wasn't actually the only one who was resurrected back to life. It says, the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. Now, they came out of their tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city of Jerusalem and appeared to many people. And this account, yes, is found in Matthew 27, verses 52. But the Gospel of Matthew doesn't tell too much about who these people were or what they did after they resurrected. Did they just continue on with their lives? Did they live brand new lives? Did they interact with their family members? So many questions and literally no answers found in the Bible about this. Another story from the book of Matthew. This one is taken from chapter 21, verses 18. As Jesus was walking with his disciples, he came across a fig tree, and the tree didn't have any fruit on it, so Jesus decided to curse the tree. And he focused all of his faith and attention on this tree, and it began to wither away very quickly, actually. And Jesus' followers, they were amazed. They were surprised that this tree could just wither so quickly. But really what Jesus was doing was showing his disciples that if they have true faith, very strong faith, they could do this as well as even tell a mountain to jump into the sea. And it would happen. The story at number 6 is dedicated to all the people who fall asleep during church. In the New Testament book of Acts, chapter 20, verses 7 to 13, St. Paul was preaching in a town called Troas, and a teenager by the name of Eutychus, he decided that he would sit in the windowsill on the 3rd story of a home where Paul was preaching, and the sermon was going very, very long and long and long. So Eutychus started getting tired, and he ended up falling asleep, and he fell out of the window and broke his neck. And when everybody was shocked, oh my God, he's dead, he's dead. Nope, Paul brings him back to life. Halfway in at number 5, hair caught in the tree. This story is found in the book of 2 Samuel, specifically in chapter 18, verses 6 to 33. Now, King David's son, Absalom, whose beauty is actually praised within the Bible, he staged a coup and drove his father, King David, out of Jerusalem. Later on, when David had gathered his supporters to take the kingdom back, Absalom had fled on a horse, and his hair was so long. And as a matter of fact, his hair, he would grow it out all year and cut it once a year after he weighed it. Either way, it got tangled up in a tree, and he was left there hanging until he was found and killed. Number 4 is a very strange one. It's found in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 4. God tells Ezekiel that in a memorial of the siege of Jerusalem, he needs to build a model of the city. And then he also needs to lay down on his left side for 390 days and then on his right side for 40 days. And during this time, he's only allowed to eat bread, which he is to bake with human poop. But Ezekiel, he protests against this, and God ends up allowing him to use cow poop to bake his food instead. Yeah, very, very strange one. Moving on to number 3, David shows his love, and this is found in the book of 1 Samuel 18, verse 25 to 27. David is madly in love with King Saul's daughter, Michal, and he offers Saul anything he wants to let him marry her. So what did Saul do? Well, he actually orders David to go out and kill the enemy, and as a proof that he killed the enemy, he's supposed to bring back 100 foreskins from enemy soldiers. But David, of course, is driven by love, and he is an overachiever, so he ends up bringing back 200 foreskins. Throws them down in front of Saul, and Saul is very, very, very impressed because David, he overachieved. and he ends up giving his wife to David to marry. Another story from the Old Testament in the book of 1 Chronicles 13 verses 1 to 14. Now there is also a parallel version of this story in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 6, but as the story goes, the circumstances surrounding Uzzah losing his life, it's pretty surprising. King David had decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem, and he had built a new ox cart to carry it back. And as they were traveling toward Jerusalem, the oxen, they stumbled, and Uzzah, who was walking with the cart, he put out his hand to just hold the Ark of the Covenant in place because this was a valuable treasure for the children of Israel. And to quote a specific passage from the Bible, then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and he struck him because he put his hand on the ark, and he died there before God. And that's found in the book of 1 Chronicles 13 verse 10. Now, it seems like that would be an automatic knee-jerk reaction on the part of Uzzah to hold the Ark of the Covenant in place because it's going to fall. But no, his actions were regarded so serious that God had to take his life away. Now we end off with another very bizarre story, Lot and his daughters. So Lot and his two daughters had just fled the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they were hiding out in some caves. After all, they have really nowhere to go. And his daughters were worried because they don't see any men around. They're wondering, how are we going to have offspring? So what do? They decide to get their father Lot drunk on 2 separate nights, and his own daughters, well, they have intimate relations with them, get pregnant. The other one does the exact same thing, gets her father drunk, has intimate relations, gets pregnant, and they both give birth to sons who each start great dynasties afterwards. Story at number 10, we have God shows Moses his back, and this is found in the book of Exodus chapter 33 verses 18 to 23. God and prophet Moses, they are known to have direct communication throughout many of the early sections of the Jewish Bible. Moses asks God to reveal his glory, but God warns that anyone who views his divine face will pass away. So God covers Moses' face with his hands and passes by and only shows Moses his back. The story at number 9 involves the sun and the moon standing still, and this is taken from the book of Joshua chapter 10 verses 12 to 14. God responds to our prayer by making the sun and moon just completely stop so that Joshua could continue a major battle during daytime. Now, to quote some of the passage, it goes as follows. So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. And there has been no day like that before it and after it that the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. The story at number 8 involves a talking donkey. We find this in the book of Numbers 22 verses 21 to 34. A man by the name of Balaam was summoned by a king to go and curse his enemies, but God sent an angel to block the road. Only Balaam's donkey was able to see the angel, and he got scared, so it tries to avoid the angel, and Balaam's foot gets crushed on some walls beside them because they were riding through a narrow path at the time. And the angel doesn't leave, so the donkey lies down, it's not moving, it's really scared, and Balaam gets frustrated. He starts beating the donkey a total of 3 times, and then the donkey starts to speak to him and says, "Am I not your own donkey which you have always ridden? Have I been in the habit of doing this to you?" And Balaam responds, he says, "No." And finally, he's able to see the angel himself and realizes that going and cursing his enemies is not a good idea at all. The story at number 7 involves a Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, who ends up eating grass. And this story can be found in the book of Daniel chapter 4. It concludes in verses 33. King Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon, and he viewed himself as all-powerful. So God decided to put Nebuchadnezzar in his place by making him think that he was a cow. Yeah, a beast of the field. So Nebuchadnezzar, he goes mad. He starts to go out into the fields. He's eating grass. His hair is growing out. His nails are growing out. And this lasts for 7 years. And after 7 years, he finally regains his sanity and he's humble out of this whole process. So he ends up worshiping God in the end. Pillar of salt comes in at number 6. Now it concludes in Genesis chapter 19 verses 26. But leading up to that passage, we read a story where God has reached his limit of mercy with the 2 cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he's sending judgment on those cities. Now Lot, who's the nephew of the great prophet Abraham, is warned by angels to flee to safety with his family. As Lot and his family are leaving, they are warned to not look back at all. Just keep on going, don't look back. Unfortunately though, his wife looks back and she instantly becomes a pillar of salt. Halfway in, the story at number 5 is found in the book of 1 Kings chapter 20 verses 35 to 38. Now there was a prophet who was planning to disguise himself as a wounded person, and he had asked someone who was accompanying him to strike him and wound him with his weapon, but the companion refused to do so. So the prophet, who was speaking on behalf of God, looked at his companion and said that since he refused to obey the word of the Lord, well, a lion is going to come and eat him. And that's what happens when the prophet leaves. Now, the prophet found another person and asked him to do the exact same thing, strike him and wound him with his weapon. And that person ends up listening and his life is spared. Story number 4 is found in the book of 2 Kings chapter 2 verses 23 to 24. Elisha, who is the successor of the prophet Elijah, was walking along the road to Bethel when a group of 42 young boys ran up to him, and as kids do, they started to taunt him because he had a bald head, and they were saying things like, "Get out of here, baldy." So he looked at the boys, he cursed them in the name of the Lord, and 2 bears came out of the woods and ate those children, just like that. And Elisha continues on his way. Snakes on a staff come in next at number 3, and this is found in the book of Numbers 21 verses 5 to 7. So the people of ancient Israel, they began to get discouraged and their unbelief was kicking in. They started to complain against Moses for bringing them into the wilderness, and they were blaming God for abandoning them. And because of this, they tried to put all the blame on Moses. And as a punishment against the people, God sent some poisonous serpents into their midst, and they tormented the people, and some people even lost their lives. Now Moses, he had sympathy and he was praying to God for God to relieve the people of this. And God told him to make a bronze serpent and put it on a staff so that when people looked at it, they were healed. And that's what happened. The story number 2 is a pretty sad one. It's found in the book of Judges chapter 11 verses 29 to 40. When a man of God named Jephthah was in battle, he promised that he would sacrifice to God whatever comes out to greet him when he returns back home. And of course he was thinking that this would be an animal or something, because animals do that when they see their owners come back. They run out, they bark if it's a dog or whatever. But unfortunately in his case, it turned out to be his daughter who first greeted him. And he voiced his grief and sorrow at the thought of losing his daughter. But his daughter has a surprising reply. She says, "Well, you made a promise to the Lord, so you gotta do what you gotta do." She does ask, however, for an extension of life for 2 months to be exact, but at the end of those 2 months, she is sacrificed by her father. Now, finally, we end off with a pretty dark one, at number 1. It's found in the book of Judges, chapter 19, verses 22 to 30. A man was traveling with his concubine or mistress and is invited as a guest in another man's home. But there was a gang of men in the town that saw this man enter, and they were really attracted to him. So they started to bang on the door that the man was a guest in and ask for him to be sent out. So the owner of the house begs the men outside to stop banging on the door and leave his male guest alone. But they persist, and the man offers his own daughter to them, also his guest's concubine he offers for the men outside. But the gang of men, they still keep on begging for the male guest. So they end up pushing out the male guest's concubine outside of the house to satisfy the gang of men. Now the gang of men, they do all sorts of indescribably horrible things to her all night until morning. And when the male guest finds her in the morning, She's on the ground in front of the home. She's passed away. He takes her home on his donkey, and then he proceeds to chop her body up into 12 pieces, which he sends to the various different parts of ancient Israel to show people how evil they have become.